In the heart of Georgian London, people went about their day completely unaware that nearby disaster was brewing. On the afternoon of October 17th, 1814, over 1 million litres of beer came crashing through the streets of St Giles, destroying homes, flooding alleys, and turning a quiet London neighbourhood into the scene of an unforgettable tragedy. At the centre of it all stood the Horseshoe Brewery, a name that suggested good fortune, but what happened there was anything but lucky. This is the strange but true story of London's Great Beer Flood of 1814. It was the height of London's Regency era, a time of elegance, excess, and extravagant lifestyles. Ladies in flowing gowns debuted at Bridgerton-style balls, while gentlemen in sharp waistcoats discussed business over brandy and indulged in the finer things in life. But this world of privilege belonged to the few. For most Londoners, life looked very different. Just a stone's throw away from the wealth of the West End was St Giles, a densely packed slum nicknamed the Rookery for its resemblance to a chaotic tangle of birds' nests. It was notorious for its crumbling buildings, overcrowded lodging houses, and narrow, winding alleyways. It was one of London's poorest and most infamous neighbourhoods, a place where daily survival came first and luxuries were few and far between. In 1839, Charles Dickens wrote about St Giles Rookery, describing wretched houses with broken windows patched with rags and paper, every room let out to a different family, and in many instances to 2 or even 3. Filth everywhere, a gutter before the houses and a drain behind. Clothes drying and slops emptying from the windows. Girls of 14 or 15 with matted hair, walking about barefoot and in white greatcoats, almost their only covering. Boys of all ages in coats of all sizes and no coats at all. Men and women in every variety of scanty and dirty apparel, lounging, scolding, drinking, smoking, squabbling, fighting and swearing. The harsh reality of life in the Rookery was also captured in William Hogarth's famous 1751 artwork, Gin Lane, which depicted the poverty and widespread dependence on alcohol in the area. In this image, the only thriving businesses are the gin shop and the local pawnbroker, more than happy to take people's most important belongings in exchange for their next drink. It was a stark contrast to the privileged lifestyles of the middle and upper classes. In 1764, the Horseshoe Brewery was established in St Giles at the junction of Tottenham Court Road and Oxford Street, right where the Dominion Theatre stands today. The brewery specialised in making porter, a type of dark ale that was first created in London in the early 18th century. It became so popular that it was the first London-brewed beer to be widely exported, reaching Ireland, North America, the Baltics, Northern Europe and India. Porter was similar to stout, but the two differ slightly in ingredients and brewing methods. Porter is made with malted barley, while stout traditionally uses unmalted, giving it a more bitter, roasted flavour. By 1786, around 20 years after it opened, the Horseshoe Brewery had the 11th largest porter output out of all London breweries, producing over 40,000 barrels a year, a huge volume by the standards of the day. In 1809, the Horseshoe Brewery was purchased by Sir Henry Meux, a man with big ambitions for expansion. He commissioned the construction of a massive 22-foot-high wooden fermentation vessel, capable of holding 18,000 imperial barrels of porter, which was now London's most popular drink. The impressive design may have been inspired by Henry's father, Sir Richard Meux, who had previously co-owned the Griffin Brewery. Famous for building what was then the largest vat in London with a capacity of 20,000 barrels. At the Horseshoe Brewery, this giant vat was reinforced with enormous iron hoops, weighing a total of 81 metric tons. These hoops were engineered to strengthen and secure the 6.7-metre tall wooden container filled with fermenting porter. By 1811, the brewery was producing and selling over 100,000 barrels per year, making it the 6th largest porter producer in London. On the afternoon of October 17, 1814, at around 4:30 p.m., George Crick, the Horseshoe Brewery's storehouse clerk, noticed that one of the large iron hoops securing the giant vat of porter had come loose and slipped off. He wasn't too alarmed. This sort of thing had happened before. In fact, bands slipping off was known to occur 2 or 3 times a year, likely due to wear, corrosion, or pressure changes inside the vessel. But still, George reported the issue to his supervisor. His supervisor, however, remained unconcerned and assured George that no harm whatever would ensue. He simply instructed him to write a letter to Mr. Young, one of the brewery's senior partners, to inform him of the damage so that it could be addressed later. After just an hour, George returned with his letter to Mr. Young, and as he stepped out onto a platform less than 10 meters away from the damaged vat, disaster suddenly struck. Without warning, the massive vessel ruptured, and an enormous wave of beer exploded outwards, unleashing thousands of gallons in an instant. The force of the blast caused several nearby vats to rupture as well, adding their contents to the massive torrent of beer surging through the brewery. It's estimated that up to 323,000 imperial gallons of porter were released in a matter of moments. Enough to overwhelm everything in its path. Even the brewery's 25-foot-high walls, built 2.5 bricks thick, gave way under the pressure, sending bricks and debris flying through the air and crashing down onto nearby rooftops. The residents of the surrounding St. Giles Rookery had little time to react before a 15-foot-high wave of porter burst from the brewery, flooding the narrow streets in seconds and destroying 2 houses on nearby New Street. Tragically, overcrowding meant that many residents had begun living in the cellars beneath the houses. These underground spaces were once just used for storage, but over time they became makeshift homes for those with nowhere else to go. When the flood hit, these low-lying cellars were among the first places to fill. In the first house, 4-year-old Hannah Bamfield was having tea with her mother in the cellar when the torrent of beer came rushing in, sweeping them both outside into the street. Sadly, young Hannah didn't survive the disaster. In the house next door, a small funeral was taking place in the basement for a 2-year-old boy who had passed away the day before. 5 mourners were gathered when the flood struck. With little warning and no way to escape, the rising tide of beer quickly overtook them. Among the victims were the boy's mother, Anne Saville, Mary Mulvey and her 3-year-old son, Thomas Mulvey, Elizabeth Smith and Catherine Butler. Just behind the brewery stood the Tavistock Arms pub, where 14-year-old Eleanor Cooper was outside in the garden washing dishes. She was standing behind the brewery wall when the wave of destruction came crashing through. Sadly, Eleanor also lost her life. Others in the surrounding area scrambled to get away from the chaos, running to higher floors, clambering onto furniture and climbing onto rooftops. But sadly, another child, Sarah Bates, was found later in a nearby house on New Street. Back at the brewery, members of the public sprang into action, working quickly to dig 3 trapped workers out from the rubble. They were taken to hospital, and remarkably, everyone inside the brewery survived. Over the next couple of days, stories began to circulate about people collecting as much of the spilled alcohol as they could, leading to mass drunkenness spreading through the streets. With tales of Londoners drinking from drains, scooping beer from puddles, and even a reported death from alcohol poisoning. But these were likely just rumours, and there's no real evidence to suggest that any of them actually happened. However, in an era of few forms of entertainment or mass media, tragic events often drew widespread public attention. With news of the disaster spreading quickly, many Londoners were curious to see the aftermath for themselves. To meet this growing interest, the brewery reportedly began charging admission for people to view the scene of destruction. Some grieving families also allowed members of the public to view their lost loved ones, with any money being raised going towards the funeral costs. 2 days after the flood, a coroner's inquest was held at the St. Giles workhouse. It was led by George Hodson, the coroner for Middlesex. The jury was taken to view the scene of devastation at the brewery, as well as the bodies of the victims, before hearing evidence from the witnesses. Among the first to speak was George Crick, the clerk who had seen the vat burst and whose brother had been injured in the explosion. He explained that the iron hoops securing the vats would occasionally slip, but nothing like this had ever happened before. Testimony also came from the landlord of the Tavistock Arms and others who were affected. But the jury returned a verdict that all 8 victims had died casually, accidentally, and by misfortune. The events were seen as an act of God, and the brewery wasn't ordered to pay any compensation to the victims' families. But it did cost them £23,000 in lost porter, and even more to repair the damage to the brewery, a total loss equivalent to around £1 million today. Facing bankruptcy, the owners petitioned Parliament and were granted a refund on the excise duty they had already paid on the beer. They also received £7,000 from their insurance. In the end, the Great London Beer Flood faded into history, a bizarre and tragic accident that claimed 8 lives and briefly turned the streets of St. Giles into flowing rivers of porter. Today, there's no plaque, no memorial, and no visible trace of the disaster. The St. Giles Rookery was eventually demolished in the mid-19th century as part of the push to clear London's slums, and the area was completely redeveloped. The tangled alleys and overcrowded cellars are long gone, replaced by modern buildings, theatres, and busy shopping streets. Most Londoners walk past never knowing what happened there back in 1814. This tragic event faded from memory over time. Why do you think some stories disappear while others are remembered? Let us know down in the comments. And if you've watched till now, please consider giving us a like and subscribe. It really makes a difference to our small channel. Thanks for watching.